Thank you very much for joining the Voice of Job Seekers. This is Mark, and as usual, trying to give you the best job search information as possible. And today is the last show of the season. For me, it's a lot of work between writing articles and um, dealing with business stuff and doing the other things I have around on my property and all this. It becomes a lot, but I love doing it. For some reason, I can't say that I'm addicted like I was when I first started, when you were getting like 52 shows every year. But right now, it's kind of chilled. Anyway, going to take the summer off, going to do some reading. You guys who have signed up for the newsletter, you'll still get a newsletter once a month. So you'll get one in June, July, and August, and then we'll pick up bi-weekly again in September. And I believe we're starting the show back again September 11th. I'll have to check that date again, but hopefully you guys will join back with me. I will, however, be doing a lot more videos, in which I have been, and I'll give you those places in the show notes, so you'll be sure to check that out. In the meantime, today, decided to talk with my new friend, Cynthia Pong, JD. She is a career coach, and of course, she negotiates. She facilitates negotiation workshops all over the place, and want to welcome her to the show. Thank you very much, Cynthia, for joining us here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, this is quite a thrill, and people that I, particularly all the people that kind of hang out with me for all these years, they know I kind of stalk people for about a year or so, and then if I
I like
like
it.
what I see, then I'll go ahead and ask them to the show.
That's
Uh,
due diligence right there.
yeah.
Appreciate it.
So by then I get people's strengths and weaknesses. And as we talk about some points, we're going to try to hit all 5 points on negotiating for women of color. Um, we particularly, around this time, people are looking at new job prospects. And having written about it a number of times, I know that a lot of people will want to do their due diligence as well, and
Right.
kind of stalking companies and stalking opportunities and stalking people who they want to connect with, because that's important intel for negotiation. You agree?
Yes. Yes. Do your research. Yeah.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the number one point is negotiating for yourself is advocacy for women of color and people of color. And yeah, I'll let you run a little bit with that. Go ahead.
Sure. Also would love your thoughts and reactions on it too as we talk. But
Sure.
one thing that I have found in working with a lot of women of color and people of color is that there's this feeling that they they feel sort of bad
Hmm.
negotiating. Like, oh, but if I do, something bad is going to happen. Like an offer might be rescinded, or people are going to think I'm fill in the blank with whatever insult.
Yeah.
Greedy, self-centered, etc. So one reframe that I talk about a lot, and one of my co-teachers in teaching these negotiation workshops and webinars, Nora Rahimian, who's a creative consultant
Hmm.
based on the West Coast, we talk a lot about thinking about negotiation as advocacy.
Hmm.
So it takes a bit of the pressure off. You're not thinking about it necessarily fully as advocating for yourself. Of course you are,
Right.
but it's also advocating for the entire community that you might be a stand-in for. So it normalizes other women of color, non-binary folks of color, people of color asking
Hmm.
for more. If you act like it's normal, you're kind of helping to raise the bar. Whereas if you give up an opportunity to negotiate, then you're sort of signaling to the other people that that's normal and that
Hmm.
that's okay. And it's really not okay, because you know what white folks are doing? They're negotiating a lot,
Yeah. Yeah.
So you have to keep that in mind. It's both advocacy for yourself and advocacy for others.
Yeah. I think that people tend to think that they have to put on a character in order to do so. That they have to get in
Yeah.
this completely different mindset and start to talk differently and feel like that they need to come from another place in order to do it. When the
Right.
best place is authenticity, being yourself,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
understanding what your real needs are. So if there's a little bit of emotion come through, that's okay, as long as it's
Yeah.
not something that takes you somewhere else or helps you or causes you to be unfocused.
And the truth is, like, we're negotiating every single day.
Yeah,
Even a conversation like this, you could think of as a negotiation.
sure.
Now, walking on the street is a negotiation because we're in this like distance yourself 6 feet thing. You know, you got to
Hmm.
negotiate that. So
Yeah.
all of us, we innately know how to do a lot of these things, but it's that feeling of being in that formal negotiation context that I think intimidates a lot of people. But it's important to remember you have the skills. And I agree, like, you know, you might need to code switch somewhat sometimes, but like don't lose that authentic core of yourself. And showing a bit of emotion, I think, shows people that you really care. And people tend to like that and respect it too.
Yeah, I agree. And, I think you've nailed it pretty well. Is that people get out of the box and become, get out of, they're less authentic when they don't do the research and when they're not confident
Yeah.
coming into
Yeah.
the session or to the part where you negotiate, because really you're going to be negotiating. It's not just one setting. it's
No.
it's from when they start to get really interested, then they're going to start asking you questions and
Right.
try to feel you out. If not, right away ask you, okay, what's your deal? What are you expecting from this? And you have to be ready on all fronts.
Hmm. Yes. Even if this is starting to get real meta, but like you might even have to negotiate when you talk about negotiating the salary and stuff.
Yes, yes, you
So,
do.
like it depends. It's very situational. It depends on the research and your prep, and your industry and all that. But, sometimes employers want to do a power move and they want you to say a number first, and you may not want to. And you may not want to do that until they've given you an offer in writing. That's generally my advice.
That is
Um,
correct.
yeah, so you might need to negotiate not talking about the numbers until you want to, you
Right. You
know.
may need to defer in most cases, and
Yeah.
sometimes, honestly, there are times when you may need to pass, and you may need to pass. You maybe need to pass on the opportunity if they are persistent, but that depends on how much you really want to work for the company, how much due diligence you've done overall. But
Yeah.
people lose when they're unprepared. And that's really what it comes
Yeah.
down to. And you can't be
Yeah.
the advocate that you need to be
Right.
for others coming behind you. Uh,
Yeah.
One of the things that we've also discussed is,
Mhm.
uh, and I think you've hinted already, is that people tend to negotiate for other people
Mhm.
much more zealously than they would for themselves.
Right.
And I think that's where you have a very interesting take on it.
Right. Well, I think this applies especially to women of color and to an extent people of color too, because we're often in caretaker roles and the backbone of our families, communities, organizations, things like that. So
Hmm.
it feels natural to put others before yourself and to negotiate really hard for other people. And that was my role for 6 years when I was a public defender, was like fight as hard as I could for my clients.
Right.
Um, so that a lot of my clients are super comfortable with that. But then when it comes to they got to negotiate for themselves, then it feels like they perceive it as a totally different ballgame, similar to what you
Hmm.
were saying before of like,
Yeah.
when we're in that context, it suddenly feels like I can't do this. Um, so one way that you can sort of do your own hack around this is to, when you're preparing and you're thinking about what you might say or coming up with potential scripts, think
Hmm.
about it as if you were another person. So what if you were your own agent, or your own advocate? Like what would you ask for somebody else? And then replace, like, make that your own person again when you're actually saying it. A variation on that is to literally think about, okay, maybe you've got a best friend or a sister or somebody else that you are familiar with advocating on behalf of
Hmm.
or fighting for. So if it was them going for this job or doing the salary negotiation or what have you, what would you tell them to say? What would you say on their behalf? And then import it. to be yourself.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Which it does make sense, and I think that's a proper mindset. And I think that's a mindset that some people will need in order to get over the hump, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Exactly.
especially when you realize, and I've heard people say that they've been in sales and they've negotiated sales
Yeah.
of a car or a building or property of some kind,
Mhm.
but yet when they come to doing it for themselves, they're very half-hearted about it,
Yeah.
and as if it's not that they don't care, it's just that negotiation does take a certain amount of energy, and it
Yeah.
does take a certain amount of diligence, and you'll find
Yeah.
that you need to do twice as much diligence and research and put forth twice as much energy than you would to for
Yeah.
someone else in order for you to make an impact the way that you want to.
Right. And it's understandable, right? Because when it is yourself, the feeling of what the stakes are is different.
Hmm.
Maybe you do care a lot more, and maybe it's like a form of self-sabotage to not put so much research in. But like whatever your own blocks and barriers are, it's worth it to explore them and figure out what's really holding you back in negotiating as hard as you would for somebody else or to get a particular sale. And then that's the key that you need to unlock for yourself.
Absolutely. The third part of this,
Mhm.
as we part of our discussion previously, is that you say that you understand that you may have to play toward stereotype bias, and everything's intersectional. When I first read that, I said, oh no, but it isn't what I mean, after thinking about it and after even going to a couple of references where you pointed to, it made a lot more sense, and maybe you can
Yeah.
dig into that a little bit.
Yeah. Right. So I work with women of color, so I'm always thinking about how are their different identities playing out in their professional lives? How are other people perceiving them? How are they being treated based on those identities? Because
Hmm.
let's face it, racism and sexism are real. They exist in the workplace.
Yep.
They are abound in the workplace. So in these negotiations, it's important to think, because all of it is a conversation and it's a problem solving conversation. That's another reframe that Nora and I talk about a lot.
Hmm.
But if you're trying to solve for this problem, which is like you want to work for this organization wants you to work for them, the problem is you don't necessarily agree on the compensation, let's say.
Hmm.
So as you go into that, they're going to treat you a certain way based on the stereotype biases that apply to you in particular. So I'm an Asian American woman. The stereotype bias of me is that I'm competent. So leaning on my skills, my past record of, my track record with my work, talking about how competent I will be in this position and doing so confidently, like,
Hmm.
yeah, like, showing that I believe in myself because people can pick up on that.
Right.
That might be key to the way I negotiate something. Whereas if I go in with a super assertive and kind of dominant kind of approach to my negotiation, it might backfire if I don't couch things in terms of the competence and the skill. On the other hand, the stereotype bias of Black women is that they are dominant. So if they go in with a more assertive approach, it actually can play to their favor because, you know, all of us infused with the racism and sexism that we are like more okay with that because that's the stereotype bias of Black women is that they're strong, powerful, dominant, and so they can lean on the assertiveness to
Hmm.
get what they want. And some of the resources that you sort of alluded to just now are there's been this one study by a professor at Duke Business School, Professor Ashley Shelby Rosette, on how this plays out and
Hmm.
how to use the stereotype biases that are normally against you to your advantage in this context. So happy to send that PDF and you can share it for anyone who wants to look at the actual.
I actually found it. I
Yeah.
actually
Oh, great.
I
Great.
researched it and found it. The
Yeah.
one thing that it made sense to me out of everything you did, and I took it a step further, is that that's why you were invited to the table, because of those perceptions. uh,
Mhm.
you're invited because you are competent. You're invited because you are dominant, and that you're assertive. So it would be disappointing to the interviewer if you were not those things. And if you're not those things, then it's disappointing. And I think, and then that becomes kind of an advantage point for the employer. Now, I don't want to talk about being adversaries in the sense of,
Yeah.
you're not there. You got to remember, whenever you're negotiating, you're trying to work with someone. That's the person you're going to be working with, even
Right.
if it's the HR person because HR person you're negotiating with, because they're going to give feedback to whoever it is, and they'll give very explicit feedback, and
Yeah.
maybe even exaggerated, even based on their own perceptions. So the main thing is that you've got to be those things, but you've got to be persistent. And I think that's where it all ties in, is that you need to be persistent, and saying, if you're whether you're coming from a place of competency or assertiveness,
Yeah.
you're the tie that binds is that you're persistent, and that you're going to be resilient. And that's
Yeah.
something else that an employer needs to see as well.
Yes. That's true. I love how you took it one step further. That's true. You don't want the other person to feel disappointed in how, how they see you as the relationship goes on in the interview process or what have you.
Hmm.
So that is important to take into account. They've already, probably unconsciously or not, like applied these stereotypes to you. So you have to be able to negotiate that and use it to your advantage, in a subversive way. Like,
Yeah,
I'm not saying that we should play to like all the negative stereotypes. And I'm saying, however, you can strategically use them to your advantage. Think about that and, experiment with it. How does it work for you in your industry, in your situation, also given your personality? So,
and
yeah, relevant.
that ties to your next point, is about being the expert on you and your situation.
Right.
And I think all that ties in, because you and that you are being an advocate, and all those things that we've talked about,
Yeah.
that you'll have to understand that there is some techniques and strategy and methods that are going to position yourself in that kind of way.
Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of us downplay also, like, I don't know, there's a lot of noise out there, there's a lot of advice out there, right? So
Sure.
it can be easy, it's easy to be overwhelmed and then
Hmm.
doubt everything that you thought about your situation. So I
Hmm.
encourage people not to give in to all the self-doubt, and to remember you have your own ability to discern what will help you and what will not. So even the things that we're talking about, if you're like, my gut is telling me that's not going to work in this situation because, in my industry, like XYZ, or because of my background in my resume, like this other thing.
Hmm.
So defer to yourself, because you are the expert. No
Sure.
one has that amount of depth of information. And if you've done your research, you've done your due diligence, then you're the expert in the situation. Don't let other people make you, doubt everything that you thought about your approach.
Yeah. Um, and I think I don't think I have too much to add about that. Going back to our authenticity point of view,
And
we um, no one can tell you what your needs are,
yeah,
or and no one should be able to tell you how you need to feel.
right.
Um, when you talk to a lot of people, it's usually people who are in power. Um, there's a sense that they have the wrong sense of entitlement, and think that you should be glad that you should be in this position.
Oh, yeah.
And really, so you chose me the position so you can keep the position you're in.
Mhm.
So it really is that value exchange that's really important. That needs to be, I think, a piece of that. And that if you don't show up 100%, they're not going to hire you 100%.
Right. Right. And also, like, the I think thinking about not entering a interview or an application process or a salary negotiation, don't enter it thinking that the other person has all the power.
Right.
It's not true. And you alluded to this earlier when you're like, maybe this particular situation is not like you need to pass on them.
Right.
It's a two-way street. You're assessing fit for with your skills and who you are for their needs. They're assessing fit their needs given who you are. And it's most helpful if you are like at least somewhat authentic, so that you can get a real read on that.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, like it's by the time you are talking salary, it should be after you've gotten that offer. And at that point, they're super invested in hiring you.
Oh yeah, it's well
Possibly more
into.
than, yeah, possibly more than you are invested in working for them. So you have a lot of leverage and power.
Sure you do. And the one thing you don't want to do, even though you've gotten that far, you've gotten the job.
Yeah.
Essentially, it's just a matter of whether I'm going to sign on the dotted line and agree to
Right.
what we talked about.
Yeah.
Is you have to remember that walking away is still an option.
100%.
And they have spent the time and expense
Mhm.
in getting to this point because it costs them money
Yeah.
to interview for the position, from the
Right.
time that they post to the time that they spend, the man hours that they have to sort through 100, 200,000 resumes.
Yeah.
um, they've chosen you.
Right.
So it doesn't hurt to ask, and it doesn't hurt to remember that you have
Mhm.
pivot points already established. The if not this, then that thinking. Uh,
Mhm.
and to really think. We can go on and on about it, but just remember that at that particular point, you have your words weigh heavy. Um, and so do your decisions and your final decisions. And the last point I love is
Yeah.
practicing every day can go a long way. And it resonates with me because my oldest son, he's about finished with his MBA, as my audience tends to know.
Congrats.
But he's really a fantastic negotiator, and part of
Oh,
that started at when he was 16.
I
And
bet.
and the reason is I used to bring him along. We used to return products, and that's where you can learn a few points about the art of negotiation. Is
Definitely.
when you have to return something that isn't adequate.
Yeah.
And so, and that was the only thing I personally taught him. Maybe there might have been one or two other things, but now he is really a master, a
Love
negotiator
it.
in a lot of ways. But and he learned that through everyday practice. And I just want to bring that out because returning things is something we do every day. But we do that with our barbers, our people who do our hair, people who do our laundry, etc. And so you could take that same energy and use it in negotiating for your career, of course.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I view it as sort of a muscle that we just need to maintain and build.
Hmm.
In order to do that, you have to practice. Like you have to do the strength training or whatever, and you're already doing it, I am sure, in your everyday. Just pay a little more attention to what you're doing and then import it to the work situation. Practice, in addition to the practicing in your everyday, like when you're preparing for a more formal situation, like practice ahead of time. Think about
Hmm.
what they might say. What are your different responses? If you want to get really into it, like literally role play with a friend or something,
Hmm.
you'll be able to see the gaps, and then you'll perform better. And then that turns into practice for the next time you have to do it. But yeah, and I'm sure that your son picked up way more negotiation strategies from you than simply the returning things,
Right.
because you are doing it every day, and that type of thing we just learn and absorb, as we're growing up as kids and stuff. So
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the things that what's important to remember, it when you've done it a lot and you realize how much you've done it, it's
mhm.
not as hard as you think.
Yeah,
It's just that
right.
the numbers and what's at stake is just bigger. That's it.
Yeah, right.
Um, And that within itself, I can understand could be intimidating.
Right.
It could cause a reason to fear, but
Sure.
but use that fear to energize what you need. Going back to our last point, remember that
Yeah.
you're the expert on you.
Right. Yeah. And also, most times the worst that's going to happen is they're going to say no, because you're going to also couch your requests and your asks and your offers or counter offers. You're going to couch it within the context of how excited you are to work for them, how, like how grateful you are that they're doing whatever their mission is, how into it you are, like all that stuff. You're
Hmm.
not going in and just being like, $1 million or I'm out, you know?
Right, right,
So,
right.
so, that kind of finesse
Uh-huh,
that you can figure out how, your version of that is going
uh-huh.
to go a long way. But yeah, if you also practice in your everyday, like asking for discounts from corporations, or asking for an exception with companies, or like whatever, asking them to waive this month's bill because of everything going on, like all that stuff,
Hmm.
that is you practicing and building your negotiation muscle.
Absolutely. Cynthia, thank you very much for spending a few minutes with us. Uh, and we've actually had a number of projects that we've worked on together as
Yeah,
well. So that's what makes this conversation so great.
I know, it's
Uh,
so fun.
if people want to know more about you and what you do, where should they go?
Sure. So the best place is my website, which is embracechange.nyc. And you can find all the info about my various options, lots of all my offerings, lots of options for free resources, from worksheets to I've been rolling out a COVID-19 career guide series
Hmm.
for women of color. So definitely check that out. It's a free downloadable. I've got a set of blog posts on there, and you can
Hmm.
sign up for my newsletter, which I also send out about monthly. It's called The Trajectory.
Hmm.
So definitely sign up for that at embracechange.nyc. Also, obviously, the way we met is through LinkedIn. So I'm on there. You can find
Right.
me under my name, Cynthia Pong, and connect with me there. And then the other place that I share a lot of free career advice is on Instagram, where my handle is embracechange.nyc.
Right. I think one of the things I'll mention that
Sure.
Cynthia is a LinkedIn top
Oh yeah.
voice, which is a massive global recognition to get. So congratulations on that. I might be a little
Really?
late, but
Thanks.
all in all, thank you, Cynthia, for joining us here in the Voice of Job Seekers, and for the rest of you. This concludes this season of the Voice of Job Seekers. September will be the beginning of the 8th season of the Voice of Job Seekers. This is episode 216. We'll begin with episode 217. I'm sorry, this is episode 218.
Mm.
I'm beginning to lose count. This is episode 218. We'll begin with episode 219. There'll be 6 to 8 shows in the fall. This is going down a little bit because for all that I do, I'm kind of I'm get paid for a lot of it, so I have to look at my paid projects and look at what I can offer for you guys, because a lot of you have been with me since, good Lord, I started the newsletter back in 2014. So a lot of you have
Mm.
been with me and riding with me since. It's encouraging to get some of you to even mention the acronym I used to use a lot, the TBOJS, which is pretty encouraging. Thank you so much for that. To let me know that you've been riding a long time. And that's going to be it for the season. I hope you have a great summer. You can still engage with me on LinkedIn through the newsletter, the video channel, um, the Prezi channel that I'm still adding videos for, and you'll see probably a whole lot more videos than you see anything else. And of course, articles where I write, you can go to voicejobseekers.com for that. Thank you for leaving messages for me on the voicemail as well. Appreciate it. Thank you very much. Have a great summer, and I'll see you soon.